You think money buys power today. You have no idea how literal that statement used to be. In early California, money didn't just influence power. Money was power completely, absolutely, without exception. If you had money, you owned everything: the courts, the police, the land, the government, other people's lives. Everything was for sale, and whoever had the most money controlled it all. If you didn't have money, you were nothing. Your work didn't matter. Your rights didn't exist. Your life had no value. You could be robbed, beaten, killed, and nothing would happen to the person who did it if they had more money than you. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't about influence or advantage. This was direct, transactional, mathematical. More money equals more power. Less money equals less power. No money equals no power at all. In 1850s California, you could buy a verdict from a judge for $500. You could buy a mining claim someone else discovered for whatever the corrupt land office charged. You could buy votes, laws, protection, justice, literally everything. And the people without money, they worked themselves to death and owned nothing. They found gold and lost it to richer men. They built businesses and watched them get stolen. They followed the law and got punished anyway, because power didn't come from hard work or following rules or being right. Power came from money. Only money. This is the story of how early California created the most brutal class system in American history. How money determined whether you lived or died, whether you succeeded or failed, whether you mattered or disappeared. This is how California proved that money meant power, and if you arrived without money, you were prey for everyone who had it. Let me show you exactly how this worked, and why you should be grateful you weren't born then. Let's set the scene. California, 1848 to the 1870s. Before gold was discovered, California was a quiet backwater, maybe 15,000 non-native residents, a handful of settlements. No real economy, no government infrastructure, just Mexican ranchos, a few American settlers, and wide-open territory. Then James Marshall found gold at Sutter's mill in January 1848. Everything changed instantly. Word spread across America, across the world. California had gold, unlimited gold. Anyone could get rich. People abandoned everything and rushed to California. Farmers left their farms. Merchants left their stores. Sailors jumped ship. Families sold everything they owned for passage. By 1849, tens of thousands were arriving. By 1850, over 90,000 people. By 1852, 250,000 people flooded into California. They came from everywhere: Eastern America, Europe, China, Mexico, South America, Australia. All of them chasing the same dream: find gold, get rich, escape poverty. But here's what they found instead. No functioning government, no established courts, no police force, no land registration system, no laws anyone enforced. No infrastructure, no services, just chaos, complete, total chaos. And into that chaos came two types of people: those with money already and those hoping to get it. The people who arrived with money, established merchants, wealthy speculators, connected politicians, immediately grabbed power. They became the judges even though they had no legal training. They became sheriffs even though they had no law enforcement experience. They became land officials even though they knew nothing about property law. They took these positions not to serve the public. They took them to make money. Because in California, government positions weren't about public service. They were business investments. You became a judge so you could sell verdicts. You became a land official so you could steal property. You became a sheriff so you could collect bribes. The people who arrived without money, the miners, the laborers, the dreamers, entered a world designed to take everything from them. You might find gold, but keeping it required paying off claim recorders, judges, sheriffs, and anyone else with power over you. You might build a business, but maintaining it required constant bribes to officials who could shut you down on a whim. You might own property, but defending it required hiring lawyers and paying judges more than whoever wanted to take it from you. Every single system in early California operated on one principle: whoever pays most wins. There was no fairness, no justice, no merit, no rule of law, just money. raw, direct, transactional power through money. The wealthy bought favorable laws, they bought court decisions. They bought police protection. They bought land titles. They bought election results. They bought everything. The poor worked, and worked, and worked, and died poor, because the system wasn't designed to reward hard work or intelligence or honesty. The system was designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of people who already had money. This was frontier capitalism without rules, without oversight, without restraint. And it created the most brutal class divide you can imagine. The rich lived like kings. They owned mansions while others slept in tents. They ate imported luxuries while others starved. They controlled armies of workers who had no rights. The poor were disposable, replaceable, worthless. That was early California, a place where money meant everything, where power flowed only to those who could pay for it, and where everyone else suffered. Let's talk about what daily life looked like depending on how much money you had. If you were wealthy, California was paradise. You lived in a proper house, maybe in San Francisco, Sacramento, or one of the growing towns. Your house had real furniture shipped from the East Coast or Europe. You had servants. You ate imported food. You wore quality clothing. You didn't work with your hands. You owned things, businesses, property, mining claims. You collected money from people who actually did the work. You walked down the street and people treated you with respect, not because you earned it, because they feared you. They knew you could destroy them, financially, legally, socially, if they offended you. Your children went to private schools. Your family stayed healthy because you could afford doctors. Your future was secure. Now let's talk about everyone else. If you were a miner without money, you lived in a tent, or a crude shack you built yourself from whatever materials you could find. No real floor, no insulation, no heat except a small fire. When it rained, your shelter flooded. When it got cold, you froze. When it got hot, you baked. You slept on the ground or on a rough bed made from branches and canvas. You owned maybe 2 sets of clothes, one you wore, one you washed when you had time, which was rarely. Food was whatever you could afford, usually beans, bacon, hard bread, sometimes rice. If you were lucky, potatoes, no vegetables, no fruit, no variety. Everything was expensive because merchants controlled supply and charged whatever they wanted. A single egg could cost $1, when a day's wages for labor was maybe $2 or $3. A pound of coffee cost several dollars. Fresh meat was a luxury you rarely afforded. You cooked over an open fire. You had one pot, one pan, maybe a cup. You ate the same meal every day because you couldn't afford anything else and didn't have equipment to cook variety. Water came from rivers or streams, the same water everyone else used, contaminated with human waste, mining runoff, dead animals, disease. You had no bathroom. You went outside, into the woods if you were near trees, into a hole in the ground if you weren't. No privacy, no sanitation. You bathed rarely. Water was cold. You had no soap, or if you did, it was precious. You wore the same clothes for weeks. Everyone stank. Everyone had lice. Everyone had skin infection. If you got sick, you kept working. You had no choice. Missing work meant no money. No money meant no food. You worked every single day, sunup to sundown, mining, digging, panning, breaking rocks, moving dirt, brutal, endless physical labor. Your hands bled and calloused. Your back ached constantly. Your joints swelled. You aged years in months. And at the end of the day, you owned nothing. The gold you found, you had to pay claim fees, pay for supplies at inflated prices, pay bribes to officials, pay for everything. By the time you covered your costs, you had almost nothing left. You couldn't save money. You couldn't invest. You couldn't improve your situation. You were trapped in survival. Every single day was about making enough to eat and sleep and wake up to do it again. Now imagine you worked for someone else in a mine, on a construction crew, in a lumber camp. You had even less control. You lived where your employer told you to live, often in barracks, cramped, dirty, shared with dozens of other men. You ate what your employer provided, usually terrible food at inflated prices from the company store. You got paid in scrip, company currency only accepted at the company store, where prices were marked up 200–300%. You worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Dangerous work. Mining accidents, construction accidents, logging accidents. Men died constantly, and you couldn't leave because you owed money to the company store. You were in debt. If you tried to leave, they'd have you arrested. This was wage slavery. Meanwhile, the wealthy owner of that mine or lumber operation lived in San Francisco in a mansion. He never saw the work, never faced the danger, never suffered. He just collected the money. Money built on your destroyed body. This is what early California meant if you didn't have wealth. You survived day to day. You owned nothing. You had no future. You were a tool used by people with money until you broke. Then they replaced you with the next desperate person. Money meant the difference between living as a human being and existing as disposable labor. Every single day proved it. Let's get specific about how money created power in the California economy. Mining was the foundation of everything, and mining showed exactly how money meant power. If you were an individual miner with no capital, here's your reality. You arrived at the gold fields with basic equipment: a pan, a pickaxe, a shovel, maybe $50 in your pocket if you were lucky. You staked a claim. You started working, backbreaking labor, hours and hours of digging, hauling, panning. If you found gold, and that was a big if, you now faced a problem. Claim jumpers. Men with more money hired thugs to drive you off your claim. You couldn't fight them. You had no resources, no protection. You went to the land office to register your claim properly. The official wanted a bribe. You couldn't afford it. Your claim registration got delayed or lost. Meanwhile, someone with money paid the bribe and registered the same claim in their name. You went to court. The judge was paid by the other party. You lost. Your claim went to them. All your work, all your gold, gone to someone with more money. This happened thousands of times. Now let's say you got lucky. You avoided claim jumpers. You kept your claim. You found decent gold. You still faced massive expenses. Equipment wore out. You needed to buy more. The merchant charged you triple what it was worth. You had no choice. You paid. Food was expensive. Lodging was expensive. Everything was expensive because merchants formed cartels and fixed prices. By the time you paid for everything, you barely broke even. Meanwhile, the merchants got rich. They didn't mine. They didn't risk their lives. They just sold supplies at inflated prices and accumulated wealth. Or consider hydraulic mining, the industrial mining that developed in the 1850s. This required massive capital investment, water systems, equipment, land. You needed thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to start. Individual miners couldn't afford it. Only wealthy investors could. So wealthy men formed mining companies. They bought up claims. They brought in hydraulic equipment. They hired workers at terrible wages. Those workers did brutal labor. They blasted hillsides with water cannons. They shoveled tons of gravel. They worked in dangerous conditions where accidents killed regularly. And they got paid maybe $3 a day. No benefits, no security, no safety equipment. The company owners got rich. The workers stayed poor. Same pattern in every industry. Lumber. Individual loggers couldn't compete with large lumber companies owned by wealthy investors. Those companies owned the land, the equipment, the mills. They paid workers minimum wages and charged maximum prices. Farming. Large landowners controlled the best land they acquired through bribes and corrupt land deals. Small farmers struggled on marginal land and went into debt to merchants and banks. The banks were the worst. If you needed money, and everyone needed money eventually, you went to a bank. The bank charged you outrageous interest rates, 15, 20, 30% annually, sometimes more. You took the loan because you had no choice. You couldn't repay it. The interest was too high. The bank foreclosed. Now they owned your property, your equipment, everything. This was the system. Banks loaned money they knew borrowers couldn't repay. Then they took everything when borrowers defaulted. Completely legal, completely deliberate. The banks got richer. The borrowers lost everything. Here's another way money meant power: labor. Workers tried to organize. They tried to demand fair wages and better conditions. The wealthy owners crushed them. How? By paying the police to break strikes. By paying judges to rule unions illegal. By paying politicians to pass anti-labor laws. Workers had no power because they had no money to buy influence. Owners had total power because they could pay everyone. In 1850s San Francisco, when workers struck for better wages, companies hired thugs to beat them up. The police, who were paid by the companies, watched. Sometimes they helped. The strikers had no recourse, no protection, no rights that money didn't have to respect. Or look at Chinese workers. They were brought to California to work on railroads and in mines. They worked for half the wages of white workers. They did the most dangerous jobs. Why did they accept this? Because they had no money and no alternatives. The railroad companies and mine owners got rich from their labor. The Chinese workers died by the thousands and owned nothing. Money meant power over their lives. Complete power. Every economic system in early California reinforced the same principle. If you have money, you can buy land, equipment, influence, protection, labor, laws, everything. If you don't have money, you work until you die and someone else profits from your labor. There was no middle class, no economic mobility, no fairness. Just two groups, those with money and power and those without money who had nothing. Money even determined whether you lived or died. Let's talk about disease first. Early California was a disease nightmare. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis. Diseases killed thousands, but who died depended on wealth. If you were wealthy, you had protection. You lived in a clean house with proper sanitation. You could afford clean water either shipped in or from protected wells. You could afford good food that kept you healthy. You could afford doctors. When you got sick, you received actual medical care. Not great care, medicine was primitive everywhere, but you got attention, you got rest. You got medications that might help. Your chance of survival was decent. If you were poor, disease was a death sentence. You lived in filthy conditions, contaminated water, no sanitation, overcrowded housing where disease spread instantly. You ate poor food that left you malnourished and vulnerable. When you got sick, you kept working. You had no choice. No work meant no money. No money meant no food. You got sicker. You got weaker. Eventually you collapsed. Maybe you found a charity hospital. Those existed barely, overcrowded, understaffed, often run by people who cared but had no resources. You might survive, probably you died. Nobody cared, nobody even counted. Thousands died and disappeared into unmarked graves. Workplace injuries showed the same pattern. Mining was incredibly dangerous. Cave-ins, explosions, falls, equipment accidents. Men died every single day in California's mines. If you owned the mine, you were safe. You were never underground. You were never in danger. If you worked in the mine, you faced death constantly. And when you got injured, broken bones, crushed limbs, severe wounds, your treatment depended on money. Wealthy people could afford surgeons. Even primitive 19th century surgery gave you a chance. Poor workers got nothing. Maybe another worker would splint your broken leg. Maybe. If your injury prevented you from working, you starved. No workers' compensation. No disability payments. No support. You were used up and discarded. Here's a specific example: hydraulic mining. This process involved blasting hillsides with high-pressure water. The walls of these mining sites would collapse without warning. Tons of earth and rock would bury workers. Men died in these collapses regularly. The company would dig out the bodies sometimes. Sometimes they just kept working and left the dead buried. The company paid the family nothing. No compensation, no apology, nothing. They hired a replacement the next day. Why? Because workers were cheap and plentiful. Life had no value if you didn't have money. Medical care itself proved money meant power. Doctors charged based on wealth. Same treatment, different prices. A wealthy patient got charged $50 and received attentive care. A poor patient got charged $5 and received minimal attention, if they could even find a doctor who would see them. Some doctors refused to treat poor patients at all, not worth their time. And hospitals operated the same way. Private hospitals served wealthy patients in comfortable conditions. Charity hospitals served poor patients in terrible conditions. Overcrowded wards, minimal staff, no supplies. Your survival depended not on how sick you were, but on how much money you had. Life expectancy reflected this brutally. Wealthy Californians lived into their 60s or 70s. Not great by modern standards, but reasonable for the 19th century. Poor workers, miners, laborers, they died in their 30s and 40s, sometimes younger, not from old age, from disease, from injury, from exhaustion, from malnutrition. Their bodies gave out because California used them up, and the wealthy didn't care. Why would they? There were always more poor people arriving, desperate for any opportunity. Money bought health, money bought safety, money bought medical care, money bought life. No money meant you were disposable. Your death meant nothing, you'd be replaced immediately. This is what money meant power looked like when it came to life and death. The rich lived, the poor died, simple as that. Want to see money as power most clearly? Look at crime and justice. In early California, justice was for sale, completely, openly. Let me show you exactly how this worked. You're a miner, someone steals your gold, you know who did it, you have witnesses, you go to the sheriff. The sheriff asks, did they steal more than the thief can pay me to ignore this? If your stolen gold is worth less than what the thief can bribe him with, the sheriff does nothing. If it's worth more, the sheriff might arrest the thief and then ask you for money to keep him arrested. Everything had a price. You decide to take the thief to court. The thief pays the judge $500. You can't afford that. The judge rules against you. Your evidence doesn't matter. Your witnesses don't matter. The law doesn't matter. Only money matters. You just got robbed twice. Once by the thief. Once by the justice system. This wasn't unusual. This was standard. Judges sold verdicts openly. Everyone knew it. Everyone participated. Criminal cases worked the same way. If you were wealthy and killed someone, you paid the judge. You paid the jury. You paid the prosecutor to barely try the case. You walked free. If you were poor and killed someone, even in self-defense, you couldn't afford to pay anyone. You got convicted. You went to prison, or you hanged. Justice had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Only wealth. Here's a real pattern from 1850s California. Wealthy men almost never got convicted of serious crimes. They could literally commit murder and buy their way out. Poor men got convicted of everything. Sometimes crimes they didn't commit, because they couldn't pay for justice. Police were worse than criminals. Police officers in early California worked for whoever paid them. They provided protection to businesses, meaning they ignored crimes against businesses that paid them monthly bribes. Gambling dens paid the police. Brothels paid the police. Saloons paid the police. Even criminals paid the police. Everyone paid. Everyone got protection based on how much they paid. If you were a regular citizen who got robbed and couldn't pay the police extra, they didn't care. They wouldn't investigate. They wouldn't help. But if you were a wealthy merchant who paid police regularly and your store got robbed, they'd hunt down the thief immediately. Same crime, different response, based entirely on money. Violence followed the same pattern. If you were wealthy, you could hire enforcers, private security, thugs who protected you and intimidated your enemies. You could literally assault people or have them assaulted with no consequences because you'd pay off the police and the courts. If you were poor, you had no protection. Anyone could victimize you, you had no recourse. Land disputes showed this perfectly. Wealthy speculators wanted land that poor families owned. They'd hire thugs to drive the families off. The families would complain to authorities. The authorities did nothing because the wealthy speculators paid them. The families lost their land, legally, through violence. With full government approval. Here's the darkest part. Even murder worked this way. If a wealthy person wanted someone dead, they could make it happen. Hire a killer. Pay the police to ignore it. Pay the coroner to rule it an accident. Pay the judge to dismiss any investigation. Complete immunity through money. Poor people who fought back got killed or imprisoned because they couldn't afford protection. This created a society where wealthy people could do literally anything and poor people could do nothing. Robbery, assault, murder, fraud. Everything was possible if you had money to buy your way out. Everything was punished if you didn't have money to buy your way out. The law existed only to protect property and power, not people, not justice, not fairness. Money bought power over life and death, over freedom and imprisonment, over justice and injustice. The entire legal system existed to reinforce class power. If you had money, you were above the law. If you didn't, you were crushed by it. That's what money meant power looked like in early California's justice system. Total, absolute, without exception. For women, children, and immigrants, money's power was even more brutal. Start with women. In early California, women had almost no legal rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't own property independently in most cases. They couldn't enter contracts without male permission. So their survival depended entirely on money, usually men's money. If you were married to a wealthy man, you lived comfortably. You had a home, you had security, you had social status. If you were married to a poor man or widowed or unmarried, you faced impossible situations. Jobs for women barely existed. You could be a laundress, a seamstress, a cook. These paid almost nothing, not enough to survive independently. So thousands of women became prostitutes, not by choice, by economic necessity, and prostitution showed exactly how money meant power. If you were a prostitute, you paid everyone. The brothel owner took most of your earnings. The police demanded monthly bribes. The city officials wanted their cut. You kept almost nothing. You couldn't leave because you owed debts. The system trapped you. You worked until you died from disease, violence, or exhaustion, and you had no legal protection. If a customer attacked you, the police didn't care. If the brothel owner abused you, you had no recourse. Why? Because you had no money, no power, no rights anyone had to respect. Wealthy men used prostitutes and paid nothing beyond the transaction. They faced no social consequences, no legal consequences. The women who serviced them had their lives destroyed. Money meant some people were human beings with rights, others were just property. Children faced similar dynamics. Wealthy children went to private schools. They learned to read and write. They had futures. They inherited money and social position. Poor children worked in mines, in factories, on farms. From age 7 or 8, they did adult labor for children's wages. Nobody protected them. Child labor laws barely existed and weren't enforced. Why? Because factory owners and mine operators paid officials to ignore violations. Children died in workplace accidents constantly. Cave-ins, machinery accidents. Falls nobody counted, nobody cared. Their families needed the money too desperately to complain. If you were an orphan, you had even less value. Orphanages existed, but they were often just labor farms. They hired children out to work and kept their wages. The children got minimal food, minimal shelter, harsh treatment. They were property, income sources, not human beings to be protected. Immigrants faced the most systematic exploitation. Chinese immigrants built California. They mined gold, they built railroads, they worked farms, and they were treated like slaves. Chinese workers got paid half what white workers got for the same work, sometimes harder work. Why? Because they had no power to demand more, no legal status, no political representation, no money to buy influence. Labor contractors brought Chinese workers to California under contracts that were basically indentured servitude. The workers owed money for their passage, they had to work it off. But the contractors kept raising the debt, charging for food, for housing, for supplies. The workers could never pay it off. They were trapped. If they complained, they got deported. If they tried to leave, they got arrested for breach of contract. The contractors got rich. The workers owned nothing. And this was completely legal. Because the contractors paid officials to keep it legal. Chinese workers couldn't testify in court against white people. So if they were robbed, assaulted, or cheated, they had no legal recourse. White employers could refuse to pay them. Chinese workers couldn't sue. This created a system of racial exploitation based entirely on money and power. Wealthy white businessmen could extract maximum labor from Chinese workers for minimum cost, and the workers had no ability to fight back. Mexican Californians lost their land through similar mechanisms. They'd owned land for generations under Mexican law. American speculators wanted it. The speculators paid land office officials to discover problems with Mexican land titles. They paid judges to rule against Mexican landowners. They paid politicians to change the laws. Families who'd lived on their land for decades got dispossessed, legally. through a completely corrupt system designed to transfer wealth from people without money to people with it. For women, children, immigrants, money meant survival or death, freedom or slavery, humanity or property, and they had no money, so they had no power. None. The absolute worst example of money meaning power came in the 1850s with political machines. Particularly in San Francisco, political machines showed how money could buy complete control over society. David Broderick ran the most notorious machine. Here's how it worked. Broderick's organization rigged elections. They bought votes. They intimidated voters. They stuffed ballot boxes. They threw out opposition votes. They counted fraudulently. Once they controlled elections, they controlled government. They installed judges who followed orders from the machine. They hired police who worked for the machine. They appointed officials who kicked back percentages of their salaries. Every city contract went through the machine. Every government job, every license, every permit. The machine took a cut of everything, and Broderick sold positions. Want to be a judge? Pay the machine. Want to be a police officer? Pay the machine. Want to run a business without harassment? Pay the machine. This was government as organized crime, and it was completely open. Newspapers wrote about it. Citizens knew. Nobody could stop it because the machine controlled the police, the courts, the government. Opposition candidates got intimidated. Opposition newspapers got threatened. People who fought too hard got killed. Yes, political murders, bodies in the San Francisco Bay, convenient accidents. This is when vigilance committees formed. In 1851 and again in 1856, groups of citizens formed vigilance committees because they realized the official government was completely corrupt. They arrested criminals the police wouldn't touch. They held trials. They hanged people. They exiled corrupt officials. For months, the vigilantes ran San Francisco because they couldn't trust elected government. This was mob rule. This was extra-legal violence. This was dangerous. But it happened because money had so completely corrupted every institution that people saw no legal remedy. Think about that. Citizens formed armed mobs and executed people because that seemed more just than the courts. That's how absolutely money had purchased power. During this period, if you were wealthy and connected to the political machine, you were untouchable. You could commit any crime, any fraud, any violence. The machine protected you. If you opposed the machine, you risked everything: your business, your property, your life. Wealthy machine members lived in mansions. They threw extravagant parties. They flaunted their stolen wealth. Poor people starved in the streets. The contrast was obscene. This was the logical endpoint of money means power. When money can buy literally everything, including the government itself, you get complete class tyranny. The wealthy owned the city. The poor existed to be exploited, and this lasted for years. Because once a corrupt system has power, it protects itself. It punishes reformers. It maintains control through money and violence. This was early California at its worst. A society where money had purchased absolute power over everything and everyone. So what changed? Why doesn't money equal absolute power now the way it did then? A few things happened over decades. First, institutions matured. As California grew, professional systems slowly replaced corrupt, improvised ones. Not quickly, not easily, but gradually. Federal oversight increased. As communication and transportation improved, federal authorities could actually enforce some standards. Not perfectly, but better than nothing. Civil service reforms made some government positions based on merit rather than payment. Not all positions, but some. Labor movements eventually won some protections. Workers fought for decades and slowly gained some rights. Child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, minimum wage laws. People died fighting for these things. Strikes were broken with violence. But eventually workers gained limited power through organization. Legal reforms created appeals processes that made it harder for individual judges to sell verdicts openly. Not impossible, but harder. Journalism exposed corruption. Reform movements built pressure for change. Wealthy people still have massive advantages today. Don't misunderstand. Money still influences outcomes. Wealthy people still get better legal representation. better healthcare, better opportunities. But there are limits now that didn't exist then. You can't openly bribe a judge today without serious consequences. You can't buy a police badge directly. You can't purchase election results transparently. Corruption still exists. But it has to hide. It has to operate through complex legal structures, campaign contributions, lobbying, regulatory capture. The difference is this. In early California, money bought power directly, openly, without shame. Today, money buys influence indirectly, quietly, through legitimized systems. That's progress, I guess. But the fundamental dynamic remains. Wealth provides advantages that compound. Poverty creates disadvantages that trap. We just pretend it's based on merit now. In early California, they didn't pretend. Money was power explicitly, obviously, brutally. If you had it, you controlled everything. If you didn't, you were crushed. Today we have at least some protections, some rights, some recourse, not enough, not equal, but more than they had. So yes, thank God you weren't born in 1850s California, where money literally meant everything and without it, you were nothing. Here, that's what you need to understand. Early California proved that money meant power, not theoretically, literally. Every single institution, courts, police, government, economy, operated on one principle. Whoever has the most money wins. You couldn't work hard and succeed. You couldn't follow rules and get fair treatment. You couldn't be right and get justice. You needed money, only money. Without it, you were prey. Your labor was exploited. Your property was stolen. Your rights were ignored. Your life was disposable. With it, you controlled everything. You bought laws, you bought verdicts, you bought protection. You bought other people's futures. This wasn't corruption as an exception. This was the system itself, and it lasted for decades, because money doesn't give up power easily. The people who built California's early economy built it specifically to concentrate wealth in their hands and keep everyone else powerless. Thousands of people worked themselves to death and owned nothing. A few people did nothing and owned everything. That was early California. Yes, we still have inequality today. Yes, wealthy people still have unfair advantages. But you're not living in a world where the judge literally asks, "Who paid me more?" before deciding your case. You're not living in a world where police work openly for whoever bribes them most. You're not living in a world where hard work guarantees poverty and theft guarantees wealth. Thank God. If you found this documentary eye-opening, we have similar stories about other states during their early periods. Each one shows a different aspect of how brutal American history really was. Because understanding where we came from helps us appreciate what we have and fight to keep it.